question I'm going to try to answer is the issue of what happens when we move from communities and environments that not that very long ago looked like this to communities and environments that are now of this shape. The question that accompanies my research and is of interest to us from the point of view of management and education, health and society, politics and culture, the question is, what are the transitions involved here? And we'll try to put this in the frame of intentions. Let's ask about digital intentions and the context of transitioning from this to this. The context that we can either study and think about in utopian terms or in dystopian terms. We can either think about them rationally or emote about them from a feeling point of view. What I would like to do is to provide a framework that would allow us to not be dragged into either of these poles, not be utopian or dystopian, not be too emotional or too rational about it. Let's just try to stare it in the face and ask what is happening in these environments where we are all holding on to more and more digital and less real. What's happening, as Negroponte would put it, what's happening when we push out the atoms and replace them with bits? What's happening is a disruption. Clearly, this is a word that comes up all the time in marketing literature. It comes up in expressive literature. It comes up in critical approaches. There's a disruption. And again, disruption can be utopian or dystopian. It could be positive or negative. What I would like to do is to examine with you and maybe offer you a framework for thinking about this disruption and for thinking about whether there are intentions involved in this digitally motivated disruption. In my talk, limited very much in time, I will try to peg onto 8 icons, the 8 icons around this circle, a circle that we call the circle of digital culture / clutter, a circle that has icons representing my 8 main points. So you'll know where we are in the talk if you just follow along on these icons. This is part of a project that I'm doing with my partner, Dr. Romy Mikulinski, who spoke here a few sessions ago. She spoke about something else, and I will talk about this thing that we in Hebrew, in a play on words, call Shaon Digitali, Shaon Be'alef, not Be'ain, the digital clutter. In this context, again, we're looking at this sort of environment, and the question, why are so many people suddenly smiling? What is in this meeting of people and technology, sometimes a dissonant meeting? What is it that raises our interesting reactions? And what I'd like to propose to you in this short talk are 8 headings or 8 titles for this thought. I'd like to propose the death of distance and the death of time and the death of center. Notice the question mark at the end. I'm not claiming death, I'm just asking. I'm using the word death not as a warning, but as a rhetorical device. Is it about the death of distance, time, and center? Is it about the death of privacy? Is it about the death of conversation and discourse? Are digital cultures and clutters about the death of the tangible in general and the book in particular? Is the digital evolution or revolution or disaster, depending on your point of view, about the death of memory and maybe even the death of death? I'll say a few words about each one of these things, but as you can see, there's an icon to represent each one. Is it about the death of choice leading to the death of truth? Is it penultimately the death of the classroom, in other words, sawing the branch upon which I sit? And is it about the death of the promise of digital? In the limited amount of time I have, I'd like to flesh out each one of these 8 chapters, saying some things that can be also said in Hebrew or in any other language about the concerns and, from some perspectives, the hopes about the changes brought about by the digital change. Probably the most widely popularly known aspect of digital change is the death of distance. It's this argument that distance is no longer important, that we can actually have given this talk where I live in Haifa, 150 kilometers away from here, without having to drive 2 hours each way to give this talk. And more of that is happening. And in fact, our friend Ariel in the back there is taking a video. hopefully to be watched later by others. So maybe co-location doesn't matter anymore. Does distance still play a role? And if it does its role change because of the digital? The death of distance is personified in telemedicine and in teleeducation. It's personified in the fact that markets are now defined on a much wider level. Art and expression is now much broader and so forth. Distance is no longer what it used to be even 10 years ago. And we need to set ourselves up for it. There's a really good book about the death of distance called, surprise, The Death of Distance, that I'd like to recommend to those of you interested in it. A little deeper than distance is the death of time. Time used to be the clock along which our lives were organized. It set the pace. It organized the way we interacted. And time is rapidly flowing outside of our control. We didn't start on time today. And in fact, nothing anymore happens according to pre-scheduled time the way it used to occur. We can talk about synchronous and asynchronous till tomorrow morning or until time doesn't matter anymore. We are fascinated by multitasking, and the synchronicity and asynchronicity, elasticity made possible by digital technology is one of the most exciting fronts of digital technology, perhaps rivaled only by the fact that we can do multitasking, that we can do more than one thing at once, and the fascination that we once reserved for just the virtuoso pianist who could play two different things with two different hands, or the virtuoso pilot who could split attention. That splitting attention is now occurring to everyone, everywhere. Just look at the 12-year-old's computer screen and count the number of open windows. That's the multitasking that is occurring. Time is no longer something that is sequential because of digital technology, and this has implications. Is time something we crave? Sitting in a historical building such as this, time does play a role. The fact that this used to be a hospital for more than a century does matter to us, but they converted this thing to something that is future-oriented. So it's the death of time in the sense of doing all sorts of things at the same time, and this sense of doing all sorts of things at the same time, including feeding children, including doing work, including working on computers and so forth, is something that is changing what it means to be a person. Because now, when someone important to me only devotes a slice of their attention while they believe that they can do multitasking, that makes a big difference. It makes a huge difference to lecturers who lose some of their audience to their present schemes. And the deepest level in this trio, death of distance, death of time, and death of center, is the matter of center. I don't have time to go into it, just to make the argument that the internet was constructed to kill the center. And the degree to which it succeeds in killing a center is the degree to which it will make revolutions. It's killing the center from the point of view of making the censorship impossible. It's killing the center from the point of view of changing politics in many ways. It's killing the center from the point of view of undermining or working around any form of authority. The flow of messages, as you can see in this animation, is a flow that does not go through a centrally controlled center anymore, and that has enormous implications. Distance, time, and center are all challenged by digital technology, and digital culture follows along. Let me say something, and blockchain, of course, Bitcoin, and so forth are all elements of this. Let me say just a few words about the death of privacy. You can't open a newspaper or watch television without discussion of the death of privacy. The fact that privacy is the currency with which we pay for all of this digital culture and all of this digital clutter. The fact that most of us have given up our privacy. The fact that privacy is no longer what it used to be, but an even more interesting fact that privacy didn't used to be what it used to be beforehand. A deep understanding of privacy is something that only our generation is beginning to understand. For example, is privacy something owned by the rich or by the poor? Is more privacy something for the benefit of the disadvantaged or the advantaged? Is privacy something that runs against some other values that we might have? For example, would more privacy come at the cost of less solidarity? Privacy is a big issue. It is being changed rapidly by digital technology, and it is being challenged by digital technology. Those of you who managed to see the Ai Weiwei exhibition at the Israel Museum that ended last winter probably saw some of his opinions about privacy. My opinions are the exact reverse of his, but both of us believe that Privacy is no longer what it used to be even 10 years ago. And they didn't ask us. With GDPR passing in Europe in May, with the overhaul of privacy with regards to social networks and so forth, privacy is not going to be anymore what it used to be. And I'd like to once again emphasize privacy didn't used to be what it was beforehand, and it is worth much deeper examination than it has received so far by legislators. Short story that is fresh from the press. These are public restrooms in Beijing. In Beijing, they're going through this process of modernizing and replacing restrooms with westernized restrooms. And the interesting story is not the plexiglass walls. The interesting story is that they're also dispensing to the many, many million inhabitants of Beijing, they're dispensing free toilet paper. However, because there are many, many million inhabitants in Beijing, they need to limit the dispensing of toilet paper so that it is not taken advantage of. So right next to the toilet paper dispensers, they have these little cameras that take pictures of the people picking up the toilet paper and doing some facial recognition, making sure you didn't pick up toilet paper in the last 20 minutes. There's digital technology employed in a very creative manner for some new forms of culture and clutter. Ironically, I don't have enough time to talk to you about the end of conversation, but I'd like to say conversation is never going to be again the way it used to be. Conversation used to be face-to-face. In Hebrew, we say be'arba einayim, if you have 4, maybe 3 eyes in the conversation. Conversation in the era of tweets and texts and statuses and emails and so forth is no longer what it used to be. We do have this as a very recognizable status. You board a bus, this is what you see. You sit in a terminal, this is what you see. In some of my lectures, this is what my students look like. At the family dinner table, this is what you see. And these are all places where conversation used to be expected or hoped for. And instead of words, what we have increasingly is this. Just open your WhatsApp groups and count the number of conversations that are not now populated, enriched by this new form of language. What does this new form of language do to our way of thinking? What does it do to our forming of concepts? What does it do to our interactions? I'm only going to say a few words. I'm only going to say a few words about the death of tangibility. Now, you're pointing it out to her, but there's a young person here to whom she pointed this out, but this young person is very quickly going to pick up a glossy magazine and try to flip the pages the way she will have already been accustomed to with the iPad at home, because that's what we do with content and pictures, and the younger people pick it up a lot faster. This is part of the overall process of atoms being replaced by bits, the representation replacing the actual thing, the thing that can be copied easily, replacing that which used to be valuable and tied to something physical. When atoms replace bits, the most important creative tool we might have is not the pen, not the brush. It's Control-C, Control-V. And Control-C, Control-V has become a major tool of expression, one that none of us can avoid using. Put yourself on a Control-C, Control-V diet for 2 days and see what happens. This leads to this notion of the death of the tangible and its rapid replacement by the digital replacement for the virtual, which I, by the way, think is a very good thing. It's wonderful. It opens up enormous vistas for creativity, but it's something we need to acknowledge and deal with. This death of the tangible is also the death of the printed book. The last 500 years from Gutenberg in Europe, and maybe the last millennium from whoever invented it in Korea, 1,000 years ago, the printed book had an era, had a millennium or half a millennium of being the center of culture and also of creativity. And that era is over. With replacement for books in all forms of augmented reality and audio and digital and other forms are pushing out the book, not just in its physical form, more importantly, in its content form. The form that is a few hundred pages bound by some insect-attracting poison and using ink is over. And expression is taking a different form. It is rapidly going to be video rather than books. It's going to be short tweets, already is, instead of written text and so forth. And we are only at the very beginning, and we're called upon to recognize the meaning. The fact that the book is now full text searchable is a revolution. Didn't exist when I was young. The fact that you can get into an encyclopedia means that you don't need the encyclopedia anymore with you. Those of you who still have encyclopedias at home are only have it because you're too lazy to take them down to the dumpster, or because you're using them to dry flowers. Now, for those of us of my generation who literally saved penny to penny so that we could buy an encyclopedia for our kids, this is an economic cost. But from the cultural point of view, it's a much larger cost. Someone was telling me about, Daria was telling me about an encyclopedia article she wrote recently. Encyclopedias are no longer just read-only, they are read and write. This is a very big change in our culture. I don't have enough time to discuss this at length or at depth, but I want to say that the increasing noise about transhumanism and trans-carbon, the end of carbon actually, leading to discussions of post-humanism and singularity. The fact that digital technology or digital assisted technology is eating up larger and larger portions of what it means to be. Because it is already the case that to hear is digital, and to see is digital, and to feel is digital. Certainly to remember is digital. So is to be any more tied into carbon? Or are we in the post-carbon era talking about new forms of evolution, silicon-based evolution and not carbon-based evolution, because memory is no longer something that we store in our carbon-based machinery. I like to repeat the fact that I still remember fondly the phone numbers of my first 5 romantic girlfriends. But I don't remember the phone numbers for my 3 sons. No need to remember those at all. They're etched elsewhere in a much more convenient, transportable, and retrievable format. So if memory is dead, is life as we knew it dead, or is death as we know it dying? And some people discuss this seriously. Other people think that this is crazy talk. In any case, some functions that used to be the center of being alive, of vitality, no longer are centered in biological carbon-based systems. And so Google can aspire to or pretend to solve death, seriously, on the front page of a serious magazine. Truth is now really heavily questioned. In the context of what we call fake news, in the context of other forms of doubting how we know what we know. The fact that the methodology used in exploration and study, the fact that the very definition of what is science is evolving because the digital has pushed out the old forms of science, or at least is challenging the old forms of science very heavily. This fact leads to an evolution not just of life from carbon to silicon, but of truth from what used to be established forms of truth and testing them to new forms of truth. I don't have time to go into detail, but I'll just say that science, the way I studied it as a student, science, the way I taught it for 30 years as a lecturer, are no longer here. We are, within the course of 4 or 5 years, changing the way we sense reality and test it, map it, and describe it. This leads to something that Romy talked to you about in January, but I wonder how many people here were at Romy's talk, Romy Mikulinski's talk? 2 people. So I can repeat one thing that she did say, and that is that algorithms are playing an increasingly, rapidly increasing role in our lives. They're deciding about acceptance to universities. They're deciding about medical procedures to be carried out. They're deciding about financial activity. They're deciding about political activity. They decide whether we go to war or not. They decide about everything, and we don't understand them. They certainly don't explain themselves. The more room we give to algorithms, because they're better, their predictions are more accurate, their diagnoses are more to the point. Algorithms are better in the medical field, in the education field, in the finance field, in the military field. They are better, except that they don't explain themselves. And if they don't explain themselves, the whole issue of who's accountable and to whom is raised. Algorithms are becoming more and more useful, more and more accurate, and less accountable. And that's a big thing in digital culture and digital clutter. The classroom where I make a living is dead. It's not dying, it's already dead. This format, in which you voluntarily spend your Friday mornings coming to meet people, is not like the classroom to which we very wickedly send our kids to spend 20, 30, sometimes 40 hours a week in a cognitively unhealthy environment and in an orthopedically damaging status. If we have to sit like this for 20, 30 hours a week, and that's where we learn, that's where we improve ourselves, something's gone wrong. And clearly the digital world introduces this idea of the flipped classroom that suggests that instead of giving lectures in what we call Beit HaSefer, the school, let's send the lectures home and bring the students to school so that they can interact. The much more fruitful, promising, productive part of this morning for you is not sitting there quietly, passively listening to me. It's meeting with each other, introducing people to each other, making the connections that you mentioned earlier. That's what we want to get from the classroom. So why don't we build the classrooms that way? If the book is dead, why do we still call, the Sefer is dead, why do we still call the school Beit HaSefer? Along with the printed book that has served its purpose for 500 or 1,000 years, we should also take the old style school and replace it with new forms of learning. Not fewer teachers, more teachers. Not less interaction, more interaction. But all of those can be fostered using digital technology, and in fact are being fostered by this whole revolution of alternative digital-based delivery of education. So the classroom is dying, or maybe already dead, in front of us. And lastly, the digital arrived on our shores in the early 90s with great fanfare and a lot of promise. Some of us are still woolly-eyed and excited about the potential of the digital. Others have become jaded and more critical. Clearly there was a lot of promise that has not yet been delivered upon. There was promise of more democracy because of the digital technology. There was promise of more autonomy because of the digital revolution. There was promise of more equality because of the digital revolution. There was promise of more cultural creativity because of the digital revolution, and only part of that has actually become true. The digital promise, exemplified with this poster, this is actually World War II poster, but it's the poster of "We can do it," with a hopeful look in the eye of Rosie the Riveter. This is actually by some, and embraced by many, including myself. Some of my writings from the early 90s were about how Brave New World is dawning upon us. Maybe the best optimistic work from the 90s is Yochai Benkler's The Wealth of Networks. The Wealth of Networks was a play of words poking Adam Smith in the eye. Here, the network would replace the wealth of nations, was the argument. Well, the wealth of networks and we can do it spirit and the replacement of everything that is evil with the digital has actually resulted more often than not in selfie-taking individuals. It's not this, it is this. And the question is, has the promise died? Has the optimism of the early 90s withered away in the course of not actually delivering on what it promised? And there's some room for us to be concerned. I'd like to suggest that there has been a lot written about this, and more is being written about this. There are a couple of books of mine here and others. There's a lot of literature that examines these 8 headings that I suggested for us to think about. The books that are mentioned here, as well as some very recent books, including, if I had to recommend only one, it would probably be a book from 2017 called Life 3.0, where the argument is about the transition from natural biological evolution to silicon evolution and the digital intentions involved in it. This list of books will be made available to anyone interested, and you're welcome to make use of it, as well as the numerous Hollywood films and non-Hollywood films that are also fascinated by digital culture and digital clutter happening around us. It is up to us to try to steer these digital intentions in a positive direction, and it's still on the physical printed book and on the physical celluloid film that we're discussing this. Maybe it's time that we graduate. So, we're about 8 chapters of potential death. And rather than take a morbid view, which I'd recommend you do not take, don't be over-influenced by the black color or by the repetition of the word death. Rather, think about the question mark. Think about whether or not distance, time, center, privacy, conversation, tangibility, book, classroom, and promise are indeed dead. And I thank you.
Okay. We're going to do some questions and answers. Do you guys want to absorb that for a second? That was any questions? Yeah. I'm going to run.
Is there a school model or a specific school in the world that you think is the best model for current education in the current times?
There's a process for evolving schools that has not yet reached. The question was, is there a school model that I think is best? Thankfully not. Thankfully, the big model is that we should be willing to evolve. And technology evolves. I'm doing a project now on conveyance methods, everything from smoke signals to semaphore, to telegraph, to telephone, to fiber optics, to the next stage. Whenever you thought you had the answer, a new technology came about and disrupted things. It's all about disruption. So the best model is one that would be amenable to continual disruption. This is about disruption. Currently, though, in 2018, I think that the idea of the flipped classroom deserves a lot more attention than that which it receives from the current authorities. So school administrations and governments and local governments and so forth are still stuck in building old form ways of education. We still, if you just walk outside and look at the schoolhouse that's being built across the street, it is still built with little boxes that can house about 30 or 35 students. That's the model of the classroom, and it is so outdated. If, on the other hand, you raise your eyes and look at models such as the MOOCs, the Massive Online Open Courses, if you look at models such as Khan Academy and YouTube-based education, if you look at models such as shared knowledge repositories, Wikipedia as an example, if you look at models such as peer learning assisting technologies, then you can see a vision of the future. All of these are flawed. They all have real problems with them, but they are much better than the ancient format. The story I like to tell is about this person who fell asleep 1,000 years ago and wakes up to a world that they cannot recognize. They don't know what an automobile is. They don't understand what the function of a hospital is. This hospital, built in the 19th century, would have been unfathomable to someone who fell asleep in the 16th century. They just didn't have hospitals. So if you woke up after several centuries, you wouldn't recognize transportation or health or military or government or finance or banking or any of that. But if you were brought into a classroom, you'd say, yeah, I know that. We used to have that. So the one thing that never evolved, at least for the last 1,000 years, is the old classroom. And it has some classic, everlasting qualities, but I'm sure that not all of them. And what we need to do is to flex our minds, and think about new ways of doing things because the technology now replaces memory. And learning by rote, something that was a major part of my education, is no longer justified. Because the amount of things we need to know doubles every 2 years. So you can't keep teaching in the same way that you did 2 years ago when there was half the amount of things to know. Because our population suddenly in one generation has become almost universally literate, which was not the case only a generation ago. When I was a child, half the adults were illiterate in Israel. Now more than 90% of the adults are literate. So that requires a whole new way of thinking about schooling.
Hi, a quick question about when you were talking about intention behind the technology. Can you speak a little bit more about what you mean by intention, and is it about the intention that people bring when they're creating it, or the intention that people use it, and like does that matter, or was that a different form of intention that you're thinking about?
Let me begin by saying go blue. The answer is yes. Yeah, it's all of that. And actually, this is something that is happening to us maybe for the first time at such a scale, along the fact that we can actually sit and think about this happening. Other revolutions sort of flowed upon us and caught us unaware. This is one change, revolution, evolution, whatever, that not only can we should think ahead about. So we should think ahead about it in terms of schooling. We should think ahead about it in terms of governance. We should think ahead about it in terms of parenting. We should think ahead about it in whatever field we are, including creativity. When I mentioned Control-C, Control-V as a major tool that has not received enough attention, that was one example of this whole new rethinking. In fact, the two laws that have been amended most often in the law books are intellectual property rights and privacy. They're both very bad laws wherever they're written, and they're getting even worse as time goes by. They're really bad laws. They both relate to creativity, and they both fence in creativity, and they both, the more they're amended, the worse they are for the digital age. They just miss the point altogether. So even legislators or lawyers need to think about the intention. And I had a short conversation with a gentleman sitting right next to you earlier when we talked about intention and its legal status. Should we legislate intention? Does the intention to commit a crime constitute a good enough reason for arrest? The example I gave when we were talking was, thou shalt not covet. In other words, there's already in the commandments a law about intention. It's not thou shalt not act on your coveting, it's thou shalt not covet. Well, in other forms of the law, intention is, it doesn't really matter what you're thinking about, and we can't legislate it, and we certainly can't figure it out. But maybe soon enough we would be able to figure it out. We already have brainwave reading technology. So we need to think about intentions from all of these perspectives. Thus, my answer to your question is broadly, sweepingly, yes.
תודה. האנגלית שלי לא כל כך טובה, אז יכול להיות שאני קצת חוזרת על הדברים. שמי יאנה, ואני רוצה לשאול, באחד הרצאות על תולדות אומנות, אני שמעתי שאנחנו חיים בתקופה שיצאנו מהתרבות, שבעצם אפשר להגדיר לפי ההרצאה שלך שזה מוות של תרבות. אני מקשרת מאוד את תרבות ודת, והאם זה גם מוות של דת? האם אנחנו לקראת יצירה של תרבות ודת חדשים?
So the question was, in the history of art or discussions of art, there's discussion of the death of culture, broadly speaking, as being one of the outcomes, and does this also lead to the death of religion? And what I said was that this is such a broad, excellent question that I don't have a chance of answering it. But I will say that there's another chapter that we're writing in this book that I didn't mention here, called The Death of God. We're leading on from Nietzsche's observation. I discuss, or am interested, in the role that this technology plays with people's deeply held beliefs and belief systems. Does the absence of center, or the death of center, do away with the authorities that institute and inculcate beliefs and systems? Or conversely, are we seeing this, more and more use of the digital for the purposes of religion? So maybe there's a revival and a rebirth and a strengthening of deeply held religious beliefs. You walk down the streets of Mea Shearim, you see Peshkavilim, you see these posters that inveigh against technology, and at the same time you see that there's more use of digital technology in all its forms, in forums and in social networks and so forth, to broadcast and maybe even narrowcast and maybe even put together religious beliefs. So it's a fascinating field. That's one of the reasons I think we should think about it. And I wish I had more time, but it's, if I start talking about it, I won't stop now.
I see that you guys have a lot of questions, but it's almost noon, so I want to be respectful of your times. If anybody has to go, like pick up kids or whatever, then let's kind of take 2 minutes. Whoever needs to head out, do so. And for whoever wants to stay for more questions, if you have time, I'd love to continue this dialogue. Okay, you all stay. Okay. Who's got questions? All right. I really hope to get all of you. Yeah?
I'll ask in English. I'll ask radically because my English is not very good. Like the woman just asked, I want to ask about the death of being. Everything is so fast. If you sent a letter, you had time to think about it. He had time to think about his answer, to be with it, to think. Today you don't respond to a WhatsApp 5 minutes. Are you dead? What's happened? So the ability, and I'm asking, is maybe going back to the body, yoga, all that part of a response to the ability to be somewhere, not to interact or to react to something.
What you call the death of being is what I called the death of death, or the death of life. What is the essence? There's a court case decided by a federal district court in the United States in Arizona, where a father sued for the right to exercise their parental rights in a court case where there was joint custody from afar. What the father wanted was for the court to approve exercising parental rights, or the visitation rights, or whatever it's called, through Skype. So can you be a father through Skype? In other words, can you be through Skype? Is it possible to be? In some fields, that's no longer a question. We're seeing more and more medicine being delivered digitally. As we mentioned, we're seeing more and more education being delivered. We are seeing more and more entertainment. In fact, probably 98% of entertainment is now delivered digitally rather than in person. Can we do sex at a distance? The answer is yes. It used to be that the line used to be, I mean, long time ago, maybe 2 years ago. It used to be that the demarcation line was stopped at the physical. But now with 3D printing, even that is no longer the distinction. And so, yeah, being is being challenged. It's, to be or to be 3D printed is the question.
Okay, I'm coming to you. We need elevator music as I travel back and forth.
Thank you, and thank you for a fascinating lecture. I really appreciated all the information you managed to pack in. So you touched on the decentralization of the web, and decentralization of the web. And one of the things that I've been thinking about for the last few years we're all aware of the fact that it's an echo chamber for many of us. And we have our own codes, whether that's religiously, nationally, we have our own ways of speaking. And when we come across somebody who doesn't speak in line with our own codes, we get offended very easily. And I was wondering if you have any suggestions how we can take the web's positive energies and help produce a constructive conversation rather than interpreting somebody else's good intent as something that is offensive to us.
You have 10 seconds to think about it.
If we solve that now, what will we do in the afternoon? It all begins with language. It all began with language. If we try to imagine when did civilization begin, it began when we first smiled at each other or laughed together or sang together or began to dance together or formed the first words and talked to each other. So the whole idea, I'm actually less concerned with individual being. I'm a lot more concerned with community forming, with groups, with families and other forms of collectives together. And it's in the collective where shared understanding is formed, is actually emerges. And that's where digital networks shine. There's just the highlights. There's a wonderful idea in something called Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe was the inventor of the Ethernet, not the internet, the technology that preceded the internet. And Metcalfe made the observation that networks are so valuable because their value rises as an exponential function of the number of their members. The more members raised to the second power, or maybe more, is the value that they generate. And there's someone who followed Metcalfe by the name of Reed, who formed a law called Reed's law, where he said, no, it's not n raised to the second power, it's 2 raised to the nth power, because inside networks we can form smaller networks. And just open your WhatsApp application and see how many different groups you have. You have the neighbors in your in your house. You have your family members. You have your family members without Uncle Jacob, and you have. So there's all these communities that are formed that form the essence of who we are and form the understanding or the absence. Now, if we use these technologies for the purposes of polarizing and moving apart, for the purposes of mobilizing hate, for the purposes of explaining why the other guy is wrong, ugly, bad, then we're going to get more of that. I think that the absence of center, and consequently the absence of well-defined borders, actually points in an optimistic direction, long term. Short term, we're going to have a lot of hate speech. We're going to have a lot of fake news. We're going to have a lot of coalescing around small groups to hate the other guys. That's a natural human inclination. But I think this technology is already being harnessed for the opposite. And these groups that we have without Uncle Jacob are going to exist. They're always going to exist. There's always going to be jealousy and hatred and so forth. But we're also going to have more interaction. One of the interesting developments, back to my point about it all begins with language, is that language barriers are being shattered as we speak. The technologies of translation, automatic, in the ear, and so forth, are making it a lot more possible for us to understand each other. Not just at the level of buying a piece of bread, but at deeper levels of understanding religion, understanding belief, understanding prejudices, and so forth.
Hi, fascinating, and thank you so much. The question for me is, how do you reconcile some form of stability, if you call it centering and whatever, with disruption? Because, just even as a small business owner, on the one hand, today there are endless possibilities with what you can do, but you are still defined by what you can do. So the question is often, how do you integrate the disruption into just, trying to allow that disruption, but to keep some form of stability? I don't know.
What do we do with all this disruption? Of course, I don't know. I do know 2 words in Greek. It's all Greek. I know 3 words in Greek. 2 of them are pantare. It all flows. And the more we understand the fact that the constants that we grew up with are no longer constant, the better our chances to float. The more we try to stick to, from my point of view, the more we try to stick to that which is disrupted, the more we're going to get drowned. The changes around us, urbanization, and becoming literate, and becoming globalized, and the disappearance of old held beliefs are all facts that we're not going to be able to stop or dam. And so what we need to do is to learn how to swim. Pantare, it all flows.
Thank you so much.
Anything you write to Rafaeli.net would reach me, and I'll be happy to share the slides with anyone who's interested. So thank you.